Hello everyone, welcome to the Eternal Balance Patch Breakdown. My name is Pojo. I've actually been going by M a lot lately. So we might be doing a rebranding type thing in a month or two. We'll see exactly how that turns out, but for the moment we're here to talk about cards. There was a balance patch yesterday, meant to discuss it, and didn't quite get around to it, so we're covering it today. So mostly this consists of a lot of throne nerfs, which is relevant if you are an expedition player due to the fact that most of these cards will be refundable for all of their shiftstone. So if you're a person who wants to invest in the new set, this is a good way to get a bunch of shiftstone to get started on that, just by disenchanting these cards. If you're a person who plays both throne and expedition, however, you're mostly just going to see some interesting archetypes being changed in an attempt to make a healthier throne environment, which I have my doubts on how well that will go, but I do think that these are all positive steps in the right direction. Let's go ahead and talk about these changes and what we like about them, what we don't like about them, whether or not we think they'll be good, and what they'll change. Starting with Azindel Revealed. This is an 8-cost 7/7. The main thing that has been changed about Azindel is that Azindel's Halichi, the cards that it produces when it's summoned, used to be hybrid-colored cards. They were Time and Shadow, and they are now producing colorless cards, 1/1s, deadly unblockable, same as before. But the primary reason that this is a big deal is because the big Azindel combo in Throne was based off of heavy mill strategies, and then you would use Grasping at Shadows to get back Vara, which would then get back Azindel, which would then play Halichi, which would then trigger Vara again and get basically your entire void into your battlefield in a very short period of time. This was always a really powerful combo. Azindel was always one of the best ways to trigger it because it was one of the only shadow token producers in the game. And it's just a pretty nutty, crazy thing to do that is no longer possible under the current setup. I think this is a really positive change overall. I think that void-based strategies with Vara should always be a little less strong than that. It's obviously possible to nerf Vara instead of Azindel to make the problem go away, but this one seems like a reasonable choice, and as far as it goes, I'm not really too bothered by it. The one thing I don't love about it is that the Halichi did look very cool when they were hybrid color cards, like the Time Shadow added a little bit of flavor to them. They aren't really quite as interesting as colorless cards, so that's a bit of a loss, a development scar, as it were, in terms of like the overall appeal of the card, but nonetheless, this is still a pretty powerful card that has a lot of pretty powerful effects. It's going to be fun in expeditions again if it gets thrown into those sorts of formats, and in Throne it's significantly less powerful, not as likely to get played, but still gives you that deadly unblockable option, as well as the extremely powerful draw your opponent's deck stuff, which tends to be really, really good. So aside from Reanimator getting hit, we're also seeing some discard synergies getting hit, and we're seeing Sling of the Chi getting hit. The first change is a pretty minor one. Sling of the Chi now has enemies can't transform your units, as opposed to enemies can't transform your cards. So you can now Rain of Frogs an opponent with Sling of the Chi and get some of their key cards out, as long as they aren't the big units that they're playing off of Sling of the Chi. I'd say this is a pretty minor change overall, and honestly Sling of the Chi could lose that text entirely, and I wouldn't be too unhappy with it, especially since it's already a pretty complicated card with a lot of pretty complicated actions on it. And especially since the transform your units thing is a blue archetype, and primal archetypes are often notoriously underpowered and often notoriously underused in Throne. I think that you could honestly just get rid of this card's secondary text entirely rather than change it, and it would be a pretty reasonable nerf to the Chi deck, as well as a pretty interesting change. So I think it actually doesn't go far enough as far as it goes on Sling of the Chi. Sling of the Chi also is just an insanely powerful card, and we'll be talking more about that as we look at some of the specific nerfs around Sling of the Chi that are following, such as Siegebreaker. But yeah, I think it's overall a pretty minor change and kind of nitpicky as far as what is good or bad about the card. I think honestly just changing it so that that text isn't there at all would be the better change, but as far as I know, that's totally fine. Okay, Siegebreaker no longer has Overwhelm, one of two big units to lose Overwhelm. This is something that basically removes some of the tempo of the card and means it's much less likely to roll over smaller token-based decks, as well as making it easier to double block it and not come away with a bunch of damage on your face. So if you're throwing a 3/1 and a 2/1 in front of this card, you now get a pretty reasonable trade. Siegebreaker has always been a card with extremely high stats and extremely big drawbacks. The Entomb ability of drawing a relic of your choice from from the deck triggers more often than the summon ability of killing an enemy relic. While the card is often good for both sides, and like basically like having the summon ability trigger is just like a really, really big deal, having the Entomb effect can be a really, really big drawback. So reducing the power level of this card's overall stats does increase the risk of the card quite a bit due to the fact that it's not giving you as much for that risk in value. I think that it's just easier to trade with this card, so it's easier to get the relic. That being said, it's still a 4-cost 6/5. Why it had Overwhelm in the first place is kind of questionable, and it has a bonus on top of that in addition to its drawbacks, so not really too upset about this change overall. This seems like a pretty reasonable thing to do to a card that had Sandstorm Titan level stats and an interesting Entomb that was definitely a drawback. Overall, seems like a fine change, and definitely a good one to mess with the Sling of the Chi deck, which specifically causes the Overwhelm damage to splash over to the opponent because of how Sling of the Chi works. So, notable effect. Roast the Walking Glacier, a 7/7 with Overwhelm, no longer has Overwhelm. It was a big change, and I think one that I've actually personally requested before. The card is generally inevitable, and due to the massive amount of damage that it deals, it is a 7/7 for 5. It has always been like one of the more powerful primal options, and basically one of the most powerful primal statted units out of all of the primal cards. I think the card is perfectly reasonable without Overwhelm due to the fact that it can now be blocked by a number of different token strategies. You can chump it, you can still deal with the unit itself, you can mitigate the damage long enough to basically make something relevant happen, but the card maintains its inevitability and card advantage due to the fact that the card just keeps coming back over and over and over again. The fact that you can do something to mitigate that consistent advantage I think is really, really good in terms of play patterns, and means that Roast is less likely to just sort of sweep you every single game. I'm a big fan of this change both in Expedition formats and in Throne formats. Like in any sort of limited circle, I would much rather this card never have Overwhelm. In Throne, like it was powerful and really good with Sling because of Overwhelm, but also like it's just kind of a nutty card, and I always kind of wanted it to not have Overwhelm. So yeah, this is a really, really good change in my book. Very, very solid change, and also a change to a legendary if you want your 3200 Shiftstone back. Not too bad. Grenahen. So the next two changes are focused on discard-based strategies. Grenahen previously discarded the cards that it didn't draw. Now when it draws the top three from the top three, it bottoms the rest of the cards, so you don't get to see those cards again, and you don't get to discard them, which was a big deal for a lot of the Feln discard-based synergies. There are a lot of Feln discard-based synergies in the current format that have a shadow influence requirement, so that's going to be relevant for Crafty Occultist, but it also meant that Grenahen was just an incredibly good trigger for them, especially since Grenahen is just a really powerful card. This chicken is always been really, really solid, and I think I haven't played with this card once yet, despite knowing how powerful it is. It's just like, it's a much more of a Throne staple than it is an Expedition staple, but it's a really good card in either circumstance. It's still a really good card for its intended purpose, which is picking up spells and being a cheap Grenadin with a lot of like useful potential. I think this card's really, really good still. I think it not enabling discard synergy decks just kind of limits some of the sort of scope of the card in terms of what decks it goes into. It doesn't decrease the power level of the card at all. Okay, Crafty Occultist was a fire and a primal. It is now 2 fire, 2 primal, but same cost otherwise. So 3 cost, 2 fire, 2 primal. Just adds a little bit of influence to the card's general setup. This is a pretty big change because it means that the card can't be frequently played on 3. Typically, with this high of an influence cost, the card just doesn't become a 3-drop anymore, and that's relevant considering they showed to discard the 2 cards, draw the 2 cards, although Crafty Occultist is actually really, really strong when you play it later, so not too huge a deal for people who are using it, again, for its more intended purpose of looting and discarding interesting cards. I think that this is definitely a change that does affect Crafty Occultist's overall power level, and it clearly affects its ability to go into a discard synergy deck, since a lot of the discard synergy cards, again, have that influence requirement of shadow or shadow, or even more than that. I haven't looked at the specific ones that have. I'm not sure if there are more ones that have more than 2 shadow, but like basically, I think Pale Rider, the Pale Rider. Yeah. In any case, this is a card that is like pretty good at doing that sort of discard-based synergy stuff. So focusing on the enablers as opposed to focusing on the influence requirements of the discard synergy cards is interesting to me, but I think that this is overall a pretty good change, and increasing the influence does mean that you can't run the 3-color deck quite as easily or enable that strategy quite as well. Solid expedition change, solid throne change overall. Does make Crafty Occultist a very powerful card, much less strong, but I think the card is still within reason, and as far as things go, like, it's interesting to see such a heavily pushed card from a previous set get nerfed this quickly, but I do think that this is overall like a pretty positive change. All right, the last one is a buff to a draft card. Freight Osri, a card that I don't think anyone really cared for, is now a 2/4. This is a really significant change for the limited environment. So this card previously was basically unplayable. I picked it a couple of times just to test it, but by and large wasn't super happy with its ability to wall out the opponent. And because the card had one damage, it didn't really have tempo in the air, so it really wasn't that great of a card. This changes that dramatically. This is now a 4-cost card with pretty high durability, a small bonus effect, and a clock in the air that can't be killed very easily by most cards that you could affect it. I think the one thing to note about this is that 3 damage cards, which were typically the bread and butter of Eternal, are not as common in the current limited format as they are in other formats. You can still get conflict rate from a couple of different sources. There's still a couple ways to deal 3 damage, but like by and large, most of the things that are dealing damage are dealing 2 and also dealing 6 in the air, or doing just a massive amount of damage to aerial units. So this may not actually affect the card's overall durability all that much. It does allow it to trade much better. Basically, like, I think this card now basically deals with a lot of other flyers very well, while also being a tempo card. And previously, while it was a good card to block like a 3/1 with, it was kind of like just too weak on tempo to actually play it the other way around, because once you actually like had the wall down, then your opponent would just sort of ignore it until they could make the unit bigger. Now this is something where your opponent can't really ignore the card because it actually has a clock on them, and you can use it for its intended purpose of flying across for damage, in addition to its intended purpose of blocking other flyers. So that's a pretty significant change. All right, that's it for today's Eternal patch breakdown. As you can see, just a decent amount of small changes, definitely pretty cool balanced stuff, and looks like it's mostly focused on Throne. Again, if you're interested in like better expedition cards, this is a good time to disenchant those cards and get into those pretty interesting new setups. If you're a Throne player specifically, this is a good time to disenchant those cards so you can make fancy new premiums of them. All right, thanks so much for watching, everyone. We will be back again with more Eternal Brews very soon. We're going to be streaming again tonight, 7 p.m. PST. Our schedule is Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and you can find me at twitch.tv/LocoPojo. For now, cheers. Bye.